Midnight over the South China Sea. The skies were calm, the waters below still, and two American B-52 bombers were flying a routine patrol at high altitude. Their path looked ordinary, their radar signatures steady, but what happened next would change the balance of power in the region. At 00:14 a.m., Chinese coastal radars locked onto the bombers. Onboard alarms blared. In seconds, what had started as a normal flight became the opening shot of a crisis that no one expected. The bombers had been flying low earlier in the night, seemingly exposed, as part of a standard reconnaissance sweep. Pilots noted faint radar pings coming from Chinese coastal defense stations. It wasn't unusual, but the frequency grew heavier as they pushed deeper into contested waters. The skies remained quiet, no fighters in sight, and for a brief moment it seemed like the mission would remain routine. But then, the calm shattered. At 00:15 a.m., surface-to-air missiles suddenly launched from China's coastline. Bright trails of fire cut through the night sky, aimed directly at the bombers. For the crews, the first warning was the shrill tone of radar lock inside the cockpit. The pilots immediately released decoy flares, pulling into emergency evasive maneuvers. One missile tracked hard, closing the distance. A flare barely drew it away, exploding in a fireball just behind the tail of the lead bomber. The second bomber dove steeply, engines straining as warning alarms screamed. In seconds, the patrol had become a fight for survival. At 00:16 a.m., the attack was no accident. Chinese batteries weren't probing, they were firing live. Commanders on the ground had been feeding targeting data for hours. Satellite imagery would later reveal launchers moved into position days earlier, hidden under camouflage near the coast. The B-52s had been marked as vulnerable targets, and China wanted to prove they could strike directly at American bombers even outside their borders. The bombers dodged, climbed, and dropped more flares. Explosions lit the night as more missiles tore across the sky. One near miss rattled the fuselage of the second bomber, but the aircraft held. Crew members strapped in, bracing for another wave. Then came the call every pilot dreaded. Multiple new launches. 4 more missiles airborne, bearing southeast. Impact less than 3 minutes. At 00:17 a.m., the bomber crews transmitted an encrypted distress signal via satellite. The code words were clear: real-world situation, full response. Within seconds, the signal was relayed to U.S. Pacific Command. Screens lit up in command centers from Hawaii to Guam. Operators confirmed it. 2 American bombers were under live fire, and China had crossed a line. The decision was immediate. Reinforcements were scrambled. The largest fighter response in years was about to launch. But in those first critical minutes, the bombers were still alone. Engines roared at full thrust as they maneuvered to stay out of the kill zone. Defensive countermeasures fired again, streaks of light against the black sky. One missile lost track, spiraling harmlessly into the sea. Another detonated close, shockwaves rattling both aircraft. Yet somehow, both bombers remained airborne. By 00:18 a.m., the world knew the truth. This wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't a drill. Chinese air defenses had deliberately fired on U.S. bombers, and the response that followed would turn the night sky into one of the largest air battles of the decade. The encrypted distress call had been received, and the order went out across the Pacific. Within 7 minutes of the first missile launch, over 200 American and Allied fighters were scrambling into the night sky. F-22 Raptors lifted off from bases in Guam and Okinawa. Carrier-based Fa-18 Super Hornets roared from the decks of the USS Gerald R. Ford and USS Ronald Reagan. South Korean F-35s and Japanese F-15s joined the formation, all converging on the South China Sea. At the same time, E-3 AWACS aircraft climbed into the skies, their powerful radar systems extending a control net over hundreds of miles. The airspace was about to become one of the most contested battle zones since the Cold War. At 00:21 a.m., Chinese commanders thought they had found an isolated patrol to target, but they had walked directly into a trap. Intelligence satellites had been tracking unusual Chinese deployments for weeks. American planners had noticed the movement of surface-to-air missile batteries along the coast and the sudden repositioning of fighter squadrons. The B-52s were not only on routine patrol, they were bait. Every maneuver had been calculated. The first Allied fighters arrived just as a new wave of Chinese J-11 and J-16s scrambled from mainland bases. The skies lit up with missile trails, sonic booms, and bursts of chaff as the two forces collided. Flares streaked across the dark as radar locks snapped into place. The dogfights began instantly. Raptors dove at supersonic speed, launching AIM-120D AMRAAMs that struck targets before Chinese pilots could even react. Explosions dotted the night as the first enemy jets fell. F-35s moved in closer, using stealth to flank and fire precision missiles at unsuspecting targets. The battle grew larger by the minute. Dozens of Chinese fighters filled the skies, supported by ground-based radar stations feeding them targeting data. But AWACS aircraft flying high above jammed those signals, leaving Chinese pilots blind in critical moments. American and Allied pilots, connected through secure data links, had a clear picture of the fight. Every Chinese launch was met with coordinated countermeasures. Fighters split into strike groups, some engaging directly, while others flanked wide to target the missile batteries below. At 0026 a.m., the air was chaos. Heat-seeking missiles chased flares across the dark sky. Radar-guided missiles locked onto enemy fighters, detonating in white-hot flashes. Pilots dove, climbed, and rolled at breakneck speed, trying to shake pursuers. Super Hornets launched volleys of air-to-air missiles, while Raptors scored kill after kill in beyond visual range engagements. Chinese pilots fought back hard, pressing aggressive attacks with sheer numbers, but one after another their jets were cut down. The technology gap was clear. American and Allied fighters dominated the night. At 0029 a.m. below, the sea was alive with reinforcements. A U.S. carrier strike group maneuvered into position, Aegis-equipped destroyers activating their radars. When Chinese surface-to-surface missiles launched toward the incoming carriers, interceptors leapt from the decks. SM-6 missiles streaked into the air, detonating targets hundreds of miles away. The defensive net extended across the fleet, blocking any attempt to escalate further. At the same time, American submarines tracked Chinese naval movements from beneath the surface, ready to respond if the conflict spread. By now, more than 150 fighters were engaged directly over the sea. Dogfights spun across miles of sky. Pilots pulled extreme G maneuvers, some barely avoiding missile strikes by feet. AWACS controllers directed interceptors toward the heaviest concentrations of enemy aircraft, while stealth fighters exploited radar gaps to strike from unexpected angles. One by one, Chinese jets were destroyed. Burning wreckage fell into the sea, lighting up the waves below. The B-52 bombers, still in formation, turned south, escorted by fighters on every side. What had begun as an ambush had now become a rout. The scale of the Allied response overwhelmed China's initial advantage. What began as an attempt to cripple two bombers had turned into one of the largest defeats of Chinese air power in years. Dozens of jets were downed in under 20 minutes. Coastal missile batteries were silenced by precision strikes. Radar networks were jammed or destroyed. The air corridor that had been dangerous minutes earlier was now firmly under Allied control. The bombers, once targeted, flew safely out of the engagement zone, untouched. The battle had made its point. China had tried to fire first, but America and its allies had shown the ability to not only survive the ambush, but turn it into an overwhelming counterattack. As the skies filled with fire, American naval power moved into position. A full carrier strike group, centered around the USS Gerald R. Ford, closed the distance. On its flanks, Aegis destroyers tracked every launch, every movement, their radars sweeping in wide arcs. When more Chinese coastal missiles attempted to fire on the formation, interceptors immediately leapt into the air. SM-3s and SM-6s engaged the threats, destroying them before they reached mid-course. The defensive shield held strong. Below the surface, fast attack submarines silently tracked Chinese naval vessels moving out of Hainan, ready to respond at a moment's notice. The message was clear. If China wanted to escalate further, the response would not stop in the air. The fight was no longer just bombers and fighters. Electronic warfare aircraft joined the fray, jamming Chinese radar networks across the coast. EA-18G growlers projected powerful signals, creating blind zones over entire regions. At the same time, American cyber units launched electronic strikes, disrupting communication channels between Chinese squadrons. Pilots who once relied on coordinated radar support suddenly found themselves cut off. In contrast, Allied fighters maintained seamless communication through secure data links. The difference was decisive. American and Allied pilots were fighting with full awareness, while Chinese forces were flying blind. At 00:45 a.m., the air battle reached its peak. Over 200 fighters were engaged, missiles still streaking across the sky, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Chinese fighters, overwhelmed and outmatched, began falling one after another. Explosions illuminated the night, debris crashing into the sea below. By now, dozens of enemy aircraft had been destroyed, while the Allied formation remained largely intact. The B-52 bombers, still in tight formation, had turned safely south, escorted by layers of Raptors, F-35s, and Super Hornets. Not a single one had been lost. Within half an hour of the first missile launch, the skies over the South China Sea had been cleared. Enemy fighters were gone, missile batteries silenced, and radar networks crippled. The Allied fleet held its ground unchallenged, while submarines confirmed Chinese naval vessels retreating back towards safe waters. The scale of the defeat was staggering. In less than 20 minutes of high-intensity combat, dozens of Chinese aircraft were lost, while the American bombers, the original targets, remained completely unharmed. This battle was more than a clash of weapons. It was a test. China had tried to prove that US bombers could be targeted and destroyed even on routine patrol. Instead, the ambush backfired. The B-52s had been bait, the trap had been set, and the Allied response showed the full scale of American and Allied power. What began as a sudden launch ended as a deliberate warning. The South China Sea was not uncontested. America had shown that any attempt to strike its aircraft would be met with overwhelming force, not only surviving the ambush, but reversing it completely. At 1 a.m., the final warning. In the hours that followed, the bombers returned to base, escorted every mile of the way. Fighters continued to patrol the skies until the threat had fully subsided. Naval commanders held their positions, interceptors still armed, radars still active. Every move was calculated to demonstrate strength. The outcome was clear to everyone watching, from Beijing to Washington, from Tokyo to Seoul. America had proven that it could turn an ambush into an overwhelming counterstrike, and the message carried across the world: try once, and there won't be a second time.